The moment Matilda Chandler pushed open the door to the Marshal's office in Colton Creek, Nevada, every man in that room went still as a held breath, and not one of them moved to help her, except the one in the back row who had been watching the door since she crossed the street. It was the autumn of 1882, and Colton Creek sat at the edge of the high desert like a wound that had never properly healed. The railroad had come through 3 years prior, dragging with it a tide of money, ambition, and the kind of men who never intended to be held accountable for either. The town had swelled from a modest outpost of miners and ranchers into something louder and greedier, a place where the law wore a badge but answered to whoever was paying for its upkeep. The Marshal, a heavy-set man by the name of Ira Doyle, kept his office near the center of Main Street like a monument to the illusion of order. He had a deputy's bench along the back wall and a habit of keeping men around him who asked very few questions. Matilda Chandler was 31 years old, and she carried herself the way a woman does when she has survived things she was never supposed to survive. She was tall for a woman of her time, with dark auburn hair pinned back beneath a coal-colored bonnet, and eyes the color of creek water in early morning, not quite gray, not quite green, but something in between that seemed to change depending on what she was looking at. She wore a plain dress of dark wool, mended at the cuffs, and she carried a small leather satchel pressed tightly against her ribs as though it were the most important thing she owned. Which, at that moment, it was. She was a widow. Her husband, Thomas Chandler, had died 4 months earlier under circumstances that the coroner of Colton Creek had ruled an accident. He had been found at the bottom of Garrison Gulch, his horse wandering without him, his pockets emptied. Most people in town accepted the ruling without question. Matilda had never accepted it for a single day. Thomas had been a land surveyor, hired by the railroad to assess a stretch of valley property that a man named Cornelius Hargrove wanted to acquire for expansion of his freight operation. What Thomas had found in the course of that survey, and what he had quietly documented in a ledger he kept hidden beneath the floorboards of their modest home on the edge of town, was a record of payments, forged deeds, and land grants obtained through coercion, and in some cases outright violence. Hargrove had been systematically displacing ranching families from their land for 2 years, using a combination of corrupt local officials, hired muscle, and a county judge who owed Hargrove a considerable gambling debt. Thomas had been putting together the evidence to bring to a federal land office when he had gone over the edge of Garrison Gulch. Matilda knew all of it. She had read every page of that ledger, had memorized it, had copied portions of it in her own handwriting and hidden the copies in different places. She also knew that Hargrove knew she had read it, because one of his men had come to her door 2 weeks after Thomas's death with a politely worded suggestion that she take the consolation payment Hargrove was offering widows of railroad employees and move herself and whatever belongings she had to another territory entirely. She had smiled at that man, thanked him for his time, and closed the door in his face. 3 days later, someone had set fire to her woodshed in the middle of the night. The price on her silence was a real thing. She had heard the figure whispered at the general store, $300, offered to anyone who could guarantee that Matilda Chandler would stop asking questions about her husband's death. It was not quite a price on her life, but it was close enough that she slept with a shotgun propped against the bedroom wall and had started making arrangements. Those arrangements had brought her to Marshal Ira Doyle's office on a Tuesday morning in October, when the desert air had the first sharp bite of cold in it, and the cottonwood trees along the creek had turned a frantic yellow. She had come because she had nowhere else to go in Colton Creek, and because she had decided that doing nothing was the one option she refused to take. The office smelled of tobacco smoke, old coffee, and leather. There were 4 men inside when she entered. 2 deputies sat at a table near the front playing cards with the slow, bored attention of men who had nothing better to do. Marshal Doyle himself was behind his desk, a big man going soft around the middle, with a thick mustache and eyes that had the flat quality of someone who had decided long ago that the world operated according to simple rules of advantage. And in the back row, seated in one of the wooden chairs along the wall the way a man does when he is not quite part of whatever room he is in, was Jacob Shepard. She noticed him the way you notice something unexpected in a familiar painting, not immediately, but then all at once. He was 34 years old and built the way the land itself was built out here, spare and weathered and quietly formidable. He was wearing trail-worn clothing, a brown canvas duster that had seen a great deal of hard use, dark trousers tucked into boots that were clean despite what looked like several days of hard riding on them. He had a jaw that needed shaving and dark hair with the kind of dust in it that spoke of open country, and his eyes, when they lifted to find hers, were a warm and steady brown that did not flinch away the way every other set of eyes in that room did. He was a cattle drover, she would learn later, or had been, for most of his adult life. He worked for the Rafter J Ranch south of Colton Creek, or had worked for them until the previous spring, when a dispute over back wages had left him unattached and doing occasional work wherever it came available. He had come to Doyle's office that morning because he was owed a fee for tracking down a stolen horse that one of the Marshal's informants had fingered him for recovering, and he was there to collect it and be on his way. He had been planning to leave Colton Creek by that afternoon. That plan changed the moment Matilda Chandler walked through the door and Marshal Doyle looked at her the way Jacob had seen men look at something they intended to squash. Matilda walked to the Marshal's desk and placed her satchel on it with a deliberateness that said she had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the dark of her bedroom. "Marshal Doyle," she said, and her voice was steady, which cost her something he could not see. "I would like to file a formal complaint regarding the circumstances of my husband's death, and I have documentation I would like to present to you for forwarding to the Federal Land Office in Carson City." Doyle looked at her satchel without touching it. Then he looked at her. "Mrs. Chandler," he said, and his tone had the specific quality of a man who is trying to sound patient while already deciding how to make a problem disappear. "We have been through this. The coroner ruled Thomas's death an accident. The matter is closed." "The matter is not closed," Matilda said. "The matter was closed prematurely before evidence was examined. I have that evidence here." She put her hand on the satchel. One of the deputies at the card table had stopped playing. The other was looking at Doyle. There was a communication happening in that room that did not require words, and Matilda could feel it moving around her like cold air. "Why don't you leave that with me?" Doyle said, reaching for the satchel, "and I'll have a look at it." "I would prefer to leave it with the federal authorities," Matilda said, not moving her hand. "I am asking you as Marshal to assist me in that process, to provide safe passage and an official endorsement of my complaint." Doyle sat back. "That's not really in my purview, Mrs. Chandler." "It is absolutely in your purview. It is in fact one of the primary functions of your office under territorial law." She had read that territorial law. She had read it twice. The room went very still. One of the deputies had quietly pushed his chair back from the table. It was then that Jacob Shepard stood up from the back row. He did it without fanfare, without any particular drama in the movement itself. He simply unfolded from that chair, all 6 feet and 2 inches of him, and walked to stand beside Matilda at the Marshal's desk. He put his hat in his hands and looked at Doyle with the particular brand of quiet that men who work outdoors develop, the kind that is not passive at all but has a great deal of weight behind it. "I couldn't help but overhear," Jacob said, and his voice was low and even, a West Texas drawl that had been sanded down by years away from home. "This woman is asking for a lawful service from a lawful office. Seems to me the answer ought to be yes." Doyle looked at him. "Shepard, this doesn't concern you." "I'm making it concern me," Jacob said. "I spent 4 days tracking that gelding your man lost, and I haven't collected my fee yet. But more than that," He turned his head and looked at Matilda with a directness that was not intrusive but was absolutely clear in its intention. "I'd like to accompany Mrs. Chandler wherever she needs to go to get her business done properly. If you won't send a deputy with her, I'll serve that purpose myself." Matilda stared at him. She had not expected this. She had come prepared for obstruction, for condescension, for a flat refusal dressed in procedural language. She had not come prepared for a stranger to stand up and make himself a wall between her and trouble without being asked. Doyle was weighing something. Jacob could see it in his face, the calculation of how much of a scene he wanted to make, and whether Jacob Shepard was the kind of man who could be intimidated back into his chair. Doyle concluded correctly that he was not. "Fine," Doyle said, and the word had the quality of something being swallowed the wrong way. "Deputy Holt will provide an official escort to—" "She doesn't want your deputy," Jacob said quietly. "She wants to go to Carson City, to the federal office. I'll take her." There was a long moment. Then Doyle reached into his desk drawer and produced a small envelope, which he pushed across the desk. "Your fee, Shepard. I'd suggest you take it and reconsider your morning." Jacob picked up the envelope without looking at it and put it in his coat pocket. "I appreciate that. I have reconsidered it. My answer is the same." He turned to Matilda. "Mrs. Chandler, my name is Jacob Shepard. I have a horse and a sound direction. If you're willing to trust a stranger, I'd like to see you safely to Carson City." Matilda looked at him for a long moment. She was a woman who had learned, in the hardest possible way, that trust was a thing you spent carefully. She looked at his hands, still holding his hat with that particular patience, and at his eyes, which held hers without any deflection. Then she picked up her satchel. "I have a horse of my own," she said. "I am not a woman who needs to be carried." "No, ma'am," Jacob said, and there was something in the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "I can see that clearly." They walked out of Marshal Doyle's office together, and behind them the door closed on whatever was being decided in that room, and neither of them looked back. Outside, the October sun was white and brilliant over the rooflines of Colton Creek, and the main street was busy with its ordinary morning commerce, wagons moving, a blacksmith ringing in the distance, the smell of fresh bread from the bakehouse on the corner. It was such an ordinary scene that Matilda felt for a moment the strange vertigo of existing inside something dangerous in the middle of something peaceful. She breathed in the cold air and steadied herself. "You didn't have to do that," she said when they were clear of the doorway. "No," Jacob agreed. "I know it. You don't know me. You don't know what's in this satchel." "I know what I saw in that room," he said. "A woman standing her ground in front of a man who intended to take what was hers." "That's enough." She studied him again in the full light of the street. "Cornelius Hargrove is a powerful man in this county. If you attach yourself to my situation, you will be making an enemy of him." Jacob looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Chandler, I've been making enemies of men like Hargrove my whole life. It hasn't killed me yet." She almost said something and then stopped and pressed her lips together. Then she said, "My horse is at the livery on 2nd Street. I'll need 20 minutes to gather my things from home." "I'll meet you at the livery," he said. She nodded. And then she walked, and he watched her go with the particular attention of a man who is trying to understand something he doesn't yet have language for. He was at the livery in 15 minutes, and she arrived in 17, with a bedroll strapped to a canvas bag and a Henry rifle in a scabbard on her saddle. She had a good horse, a sturdy blue roan mare named Bessie that moved with the practical energy of an animal that had covered real ground. Jacob's horse was a tall sorrel gelding named Cutter, long-legged and trail-wise, with the kind of calm that comes from years of use in open country. They left Colton Creek heading northwest, toward the high desert basin that separated them from the pass through the Virginia Range and the road down into Carson City. It was roughly a 2-day ride in good conditions. The conditions were good. For the first hour they rode in silence, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people assessing each other without being obvious about it, reading the way the other sat a horse and handled terrain, filing information. Eventually Matilda said, "You mentioned West Texas." He glanced at her. Did I? Your manner of speaking. I've heard that accent before. My uncle was from Brazeria County. He nodded slowly. I grew up near Abilene. Came west 11 years ago when the cattle drive slowed down. Been working ranches in Nevada and Utah since. He paused. You're not from here originally either. Ohio, she said. I came west with Thomas 8 years ago. He had an offer of work and she stopped. I had an appetite for something larger than Ohio. Did you find it? She was quiet for a moment, looking at the landscape ahead of them, which was all sage and red rock and open sky going on forever. I found something, she said. It wasn't always what I expected, but it was large. He heard the weight behind that and he let it rest there. He was not a man who pushed at grief. He knew what it felt like to carry it and not want to be prodded. They made camp that first night at the base of a long ridge where a steep spring gave them water, and a cluster of pinyon pines gave them wind cover and enough wood for a small fire. Jacob built the fire without asking if she wanted one, which she noticed, because it was an assumption made entirely in her favor rather than his. He was cold. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. She made coffee in a tin pot she had brought from home, and the smell of it rose up into the cold October night like a small and specific comfort. He accepted a cup with both hands and a quiet thank you that sounded genuine rather than reflexive. Tell me about the ledger, he said, not pushing. Just opening a door. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. What makes you think I'll tell a stranger about the contents of something I've been protecting with my life for 4 months? Nothing, he said. I just thought you might want to say it out loud to somebody. Sometimes that matters. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled and the stars above them were extraordinary, the way they always were in the desert at altitude, vast and indifferent and somehow also comforting, like they had no opinion about the specific troubles of anyone sitting beneath them. Hargrove has been bribing county officials to falsify land transfer records, she said finally. 23 families displaced in 2 years. Some of them were given payments, small ones, not what the land was worth. Some of them were not given anything, just told to leave. The judge, his name is Warren Aldrich, he processes the paperwork. A man named Cole Petty handles the physical pressure, rides with about 6 men. They show up on a property and make the nature of the situation very clear. Jacob was looking at the fire. And Thomas documented all of this. Thomas was meticulous. He was a surveyor. He understood land records and how they were supposed to work. He started noticing discrepancies early on, and instead of looking away, he started writing things down. Dates, names, transaction numbers, cross-references to the original grants. She held her cup with both hands. He told me he was going to take it to the federal land office when he had enough. He said he was close. Her voice was perfectly level, but her knuckles had gone pale against the tin cup. He died before he could. But you have the ledger. I have the ledger, and I have 3 copies of the most critical pages hidden in 3 separate places in case anything happens to me or the original. She looked at him directly. I am not without a plan. No, Jacob said, and there was nothing but honest regard in it. I can see that. What I don't have, she said, is someone willing to help me get to the right people. The territorial government is too entangled with Hargrove's money to be reliable. The federal land office is the correct channel. They have the authority to investigate and they are outside his reach. She paused. I am hoping. They are, Jacob said. I've dealt with the federal land office in Carson City before. There's a man there, an agent named Prescott. He came out to the Rafter J 2 years ago when there was a question about a grazing allotment boundary. He was thorough and he was straight. If you can get in front of Prescott, you'll have a real audience. She looked at him as if reassessing something. You know the federal land office. I know a man in it, he said, which is different, but it might be useful. It might be very useful, she said quietly. He looked at her then in the firelight, and she was looking back at him with an expression that was measuring and careful but not unwelcoming. He felt the particular sensation of a man who is standing at the edge of something large without being entirely sure what it is. You should sleep, he said. I'll take first watch. I'm accustomed to watching my own situation, she said. I know it, he said. But you've been carrying this alone for 4 months. Let somebody else hold the edge of it for a few hours. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, took her blanket roll, and settled herself on the far side of the fire. She was asleep in 20 minutes, which told him how exhausted she truly was, because a woman with that much vigilance did not let herself go easily. He watched the darkness and drank his coffee and thought about the specific quality of courage that got a woman like that up and walking into a hostile room with nothing but a leather satchel and her own certainty. He thought about it for a long time. In the morning she woke before him, which meant he had drifted off sometime before dawn, which he had not meant to do. He opened his eyes to find her already up, the fire rebuilt, a fresh pot of coffee on, and her face turned toward the east where the light was beginning to come up over the ridgeline in colors that had no good names. He sat up and felt the cold morning in every joint, and he was 34, not 20, and the ground was not getting softer. He did not complain about this. "Good morning," Matilda said without turning. "Good morning," he said, reaching for his hat. She handed him a cup of coffee without him asking. He took it the same way he had the night before, with both hands, because it was cold and the warmth was real, and he looked at the same sunrise she was looking at, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything, which was a different kind of silence than the day before. It had something companionable in it. They broke camp efficiently and were back on the trail before the sun was fully up. The second day's riding took them up through the scrub-covered foothills and into the Virginia range, where the trail narrowed between rocky outcrops and the wind came at them with serious intention. Matilda rode without complaint. She had, he noted, excellent instincts with her horse. She read the terrain ahead of her and adjusted her pace without being told, and when a section of the trail went loose with shale, she slowed the mare and picked a careful path without any of the anxious overcorrection he sometimes saw in riders who were thinking about falling rather than moving. "You've done real riding," he said. She glanced at him. 8 years in Nevada tends to produce that. "City people move out here and never learn the land," he said. "They stay afraid of it. I decided early on that being afraid of the land was a luxury I couldn't afford," she said, "so I learned it instead." "That's a sensible approach to most things," he said. "It is," she agreed. And then, with a kind of careful casualness that he recognized as the way people bring up things they have been thinking about, "What happened with the rafter, Jay? You said there was a dispute over wages." He was quiet for a moment. "The owner man named Cal Rutter decided that the last cattle drive had been unprofitable enough that he could justify paying the drovers at 2/3 their agreed rate. I disagreed with his math. He disagreed with my disagreement. He paused. I left, just like that. Well, there were words first, but yes, just like that. And before the rafter, Jay," he looked at the trail ahead. "Before the rafter, Jay, there was the Lazy Diamond in Utah. Before that, a drive up from Texas with a man named Dolan who ran the kind of operation that was more about the moving than the destination. Before that, he stopped. You want the whole catalog. I want to understand who I'm riding with," she said simply. He respected that. 11 years of cattle work across 4 territories. Never owned my own land, though I've thought about it. Never stayed anywhere long enough to put down anything that could be called roots. Not because I was running from anything," he added, and he said it as though he had thought about this before. "More because nothing had asked me to stay." She processed this. "A man like you, capable as you clearly are, you could have started something of your own by now." "Could have," he agreed. "Requires finding the right place. And you haven't found it." He looked at her just briefly with that warm, steady gaze. "I'm starting to think I've been looking in the wrong direction." She didn't answer that, but she didn't look away immediately either, which he noticed. They reached Carson City in the late afternoon of the second day, coming down out of the hills into the valley where the state capital sat with its particular combination of frontier ambition and institutional permanence, proper buildings of brick and stone, alongside the wood-frame commerce of an expanding town. The air was different here, less high desert and more valley floor, and the traffic on the streets was heavier than in Colton Creek. Jacob knew where the federal land office was. He had ridden down this street 2 years before on Rafter J business. He led Matilda there without hesitation, and she followed, and together they tied their horses at the post outside a solid brick building with a painted sign above the door that read Department of the Interior, General Land Office, Nevada District. Inside, a young clerk at a front desk looked up at them with the particular wariness of someone accustomed to being brought complicated problems at the end of the day. "We need to see Agent Prescott," Jacob said. "It's a matter of land fraud and a connected suspicious death in Colton Creek. The woman has documentation." The clerk looked at Matilda. Matilda put her satchel on the desk and held his gaze with an expression that was entirely composed and entirely serious. The clerk went to get Prescott. Agent Edmund Prescott was a lean man in his mid-40s with reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead, and the ink-stained fingers of someone who spent a great deal of time with documents. He came out from his inner office looking skeptical in the general way of a man who has heard many stories, and then he saw Jacob Shepard and his skepticism shifted slightly. "Shepard," he said, "the Rafter J business." "Former Rafter J," Jacob said. "Good memory. This is Matilda Chandler." Her husband was Thomas Chandler, the surveyor who was working under railroad contract in the Colton Creek Valley before his death 4 months ago. She has a ledger he compiled, and she has a story you need to hear. Prescott looked at Matilda with a new quality of attention. "Come in," he said. They sat in his office for 2.5 hours. Matilda talked, steadily and precisely, never losing her thread or her composure. She laid the ledger pages on his desk one at a time, explaining each one, contextualizing the entries within what she knew of the affected families and the transactions involved. She named Hargrove, named Judge Aldrich, named Cole Petty. She provided dates. She provided cross-references to public record numbers. She had, as Thomas had been before her, meticulous. Prescott listened without interrupting, which was itself a form of respect. He looked at the documents closely, pulling his spectacles down from his forehead to read certain entries. Occasionally he asked a precise question, the kind that meant he was already thinking about how to build a case rather than whether to build one. Jacob sat to the side and said almost nothing, because this was Matilda's testimony and he understood that. When Prescott once glanced at him, he gave a small nod that communicated, "I believe what she is telling you." Prescott was the kind of man who understood what that nod meant from someone he had already assessed as reliable. By the time the light outside had gone the deep gold of late afternoon, Prescott was sitting back in his chair with his fingers steepled, and the particular expression of a man who has just been handed something significant. "Mrs. Chandler," he said, "what you have given me today is one of the most complete records of land fraud I have received in 11 years in this office. I want you to understand that what I am about to initiate will take time. Federal processes are not quick, but I am initiating them today. Tonight, actually, because I intend to send a wire to Washington before I leave this building." Matilda let out a breath that was very small and very controlled, and Jacob, watching her, saw in it the 4 months of weight she had been carrying finally finding somewhere to go. "Will Hargrove be informed?" she asked. "Not by this office," Prescott said. "And I will be requesting that the territorial marshal's oversight in Colton Creek be suspended pending investigation, given your account of Marshal Doyle's involvement. A federal marshal will be dispatched to the area within the week." He looked at her over his spectacles. "You should not return to Colton Creek until that federal presence is established. Do you have somewhere you can stay?" She hesitated. "I had not entirely planned that far ahead." "She can stay in Carson City," Jacob said before he quite knew he was going to say it. Prescott looked at him. "There are decent boarding houses. I'll ensure she's in a safe one." Matilda looked at him, and the look had a question in it that was not about the boarding house. "If that suits you," Jacob added, speaking to her directly, the way he had learned to speak to her as the person making her own decisions. "It's your call, Mrs. Chandler." "Yes," she said. "That suits me." They left the land office as the sun was setting over the valley, turning the sky behind the mountains the color of burnished copper. The streets of Carson City had the comfortable busyness of an evening in a capital city, people moving with purpose. The sound of a piano from a saloon on the corner, horses and wagons making their slow way home. They walked their horses side by side down the street without speaking, and the silence was warm in the way of something building rather than something absent. Jacob found her a room at a boarding house on Curry Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Alcott, who was brisk and kind in equal measure, and who required nothing more than a week's payment in advance, and a promise that no visitors would be received after 8 in the evening. Matilda paid from her own purse, which she did without hesitation, and Jacob did not offer to pay for her because he understood that she would not have wanted that. He arranged a room at a livery stable's adjacent bunkhouse for himself, a spare arrangement, but clean, and he had slept in far worse. They ate supper together at a modest restaurant near the boarding house, because both of them were hungry and it was a practical matter, and neither of them suggested otherwise. The restaurant was quiet on a Tuesday evening. They had a table near the window and the meal was simple roasted chicken, bread, boiled potatoes, coffee, and it was the best food either of them had eaten in several days, which made it taste extraordinary. "Thank you," she said when the food had come and the immediate urgency of hunger was being addressed, "for today, for standing up in that office." He looked at her across the table. "You didn't need me to stand up for you." "No," she agreed. "But it helped. There is a difference between what a person can do alone and what a person should have to do alone." "Yes," he said, "there is." They ate in comfortable quiet for a while. The window beside them showed the street outside, still lively in the early evening, and a pale moon was coming up over the eastern hills. "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with any of this," Matilda said unexpectedly. He looked at her, surprised by the shift. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. I want to know you as something other than the man in the back row who stood up." He thought about this, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I can read," he said. "I mean that seriously. I had proper schooling until I was 14 and I've kept at it since. I carry a book when I travel. Right now it's Defoe." She looked genuinely surprised. "Robinson Crusoe." "The same. I read that when I was 12, she said. "I thought it was magnificent." "It holds up," he said. "There's something about a man building a life from nothing in a place that wasn't built for him. It resonates in this part of the world." She was looking at him differently now, with the particular attention that comes when you discover something in a person that you did not expect. "What else?" "I can't abide dishonesty," he said. "Not the small social kind that's just manners. The kind where a person looks you in the eye and tells you something they know isn't true because it's easier than the alternative. I've walked away from more than one situation because of that quality in the people running it. Like the Rafter J, she nodded slowly. Thomas was the same way. She paused. It was the thing that got him killed ultimately. He couldn't look at dishonesty and choose not to see it. It was also what he passed to you," Jacob said quietly, "because you walked into that office today with his evidence and his truth. That matters." Her eyes changed. He could not have said how exactly, but the quality of her attention toward him shifted and deepened. "Yes," she said softly, "I suppose that is one way to look at it." "It's the right way to look at it," he said. Not with sentiment but with certainty. She heard the difference. They walked back to her boarding house in the evening air, and the night was clear and cold and full of stars. At the door of the boarding house she stopped and turned to him. "Will you still be here in the morning?" she asked, and there was something beneath the practicality of the question that was not purely practical. "Yes," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she said good night and went inside. He stood on the street for a moment after the door closed. Then he turned and walked back toward the livery, and he was thinking about nothing he could clearly name, but it had the quality of something coming clear. The following days in Carson City took on a shape neither of them had entirely anticipated. Prescott required Matilda's ongoing presence for follow-up questions as he built the formal complaint, cross-referencing her testimony with existing public records and drafting the federal documents that would be sent to Washington. This process took 3 days, and during those 3 days Jacob stayed, partly because he had told her he would, and partly because there was nowhere he wanted to be more urgently than where he was. He was useful in practical ways. He knew the city well enough to navigate it, knew where to find particular supplies, had the kind of calm competence in unfamiliar situations that made problems smaller rather than larger. But mostly, he was simply present in the way that a person is present when they are choosing to be, which is entirely different from the kind of presence that is accidental. They walked the streets of Carson City in the evenings, after Matilda's long days with Prescott, and Jacob listened while she talked not just about the case, but about her life with Thomas, about Ohio, about the things she had thought her future would look like before the high desert intervened. He listened well, which is a rarer quality than most people acknowledge, and he did not try to fix or redirect or offer solutions. He simply held the space. She asked him questions in return, real ones about his childhood in West Texas, about what it had been like to drive cattle across hundreds of miles of open country, about what he believed in and what made him angry and what he laughed at. He answered with the same honesty he had offered since the first night at the fire, and she received it with the same careful intelligence she applied to everything. On the third evening, they had walked to the edge of town, where a cottonwood grove bordered a small creek, and the late sun was coming through the yellow leaves in shafts of warm light, and Matilda had stopped walking and was looking up at the light through the leaves with an expression that was unguarded in a way he had not quite seen from her before. She looked in that moment like someone who was beginning to believe again in the possibility of ordinary beauty. He said, "You're going to be all right, you know." She lowered her eyes from the leaves and looked at him. "People say that. Usually it means nothing." "I mean it specifically," he said. "You are competent and clear-eyed and brave in the particular way that is most useful, not reckless, but honest. You will come through what happened to Thomas, and you will come through what you've been living with these 4 months, and there will be a life on the other side of it that is worth living." She was very still. "That is a specific kind of thing to say. You asked me once not to say things I didn't mean. I never said that." "You implied it thoroughly," he said, and there was that adjacency to a smile again, and this time she let herself answer it. Her smile was not small when it came. It changed her face entirely, uncovering something brilliant and a little unruly, like weather breaking open after a long gray season, and Jacob Shepard looked at it and understood, with the clarity of a man looking at something he has been approaching from a long distance, exactly how much trouble he was in. She seemed to become aware of something at the same time because she looked away, and then looked back and said, in a voice that was not quite as steady as it usually was, "Jacob." "Yes," he said. "Just that." "I don't entirely know what this is," she said, with the precise honesty that was one of the things he had come to. He found the word and acknowledged it to himself, love about her. "But I am not indifferent to you. I want to be clear about that." "I appreciate the clarity," he said, and he meant it as much as anything he had ever said. "I am not indifferent to you either. I want to be equally clear about that." "I am a widow," she said. "I am not a woman who has forgotten what she lost." "I know it," he said, "and I would not ask you to forget it. Thomas was the man who built something worth protecting. Honoring that is not the same as being limited by it." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. Then she said, with a breath of wonder in her voice, "Where did you come from, Jacob Shepard?" "West Texas, by way of several complications," he said, and she laughed, a real one, sudden and full, and the sound of it went through the cottonwood leaves and up into the clear Nevada sky like something released. On the 4th day, Prescott called them both into his office with a satisfied expression that meant good news. He had received a response from Washington faster than expected, because the name Cornelius Hargrove had registered with a federal land commissioner, who had been watching for exactly this kind of complaint from the Nevada district. The federal marshal assigned to the Carson City circuit, a compact and serious man named Bray, had been dispatched to Colton Creek with a team of 2 deputies and federal warrants for the arrest of Hargrove, Judge Aldrich, and Cole Petty, as well as a warrant for the suspension of Marshal Ira Doyle pending full investigation of his conduct. Prescott also handed Matilda a formal receipt for Thomas Chandler's ledger, now entered as federal evidence, along with a document acknowledging her cooperation and formally classifying Thomas's death as a matter under federal investigation rather than a concluded local ruling. "This doesn't bring your husband back," Prescott said, with a gentleness that sat well on his practical face. "But it ensures what he did will matter. The families he documented will have a process available to them for reclaiming their land and seeking damages. That process is beginning because of what you carried here." Matilda held the receipt and the acknowledgement document against her chest and was very quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Agent Prescott," and her voice was entirely composed, which Jacob suspected cost her considerably, and he thought she was one of the most remarkable people he had ever encountered. They left Prescott's office and stood outside in the morning sunshine, and Matilda turned her face up to the sky and just breathed for a moment, and Jacob stood beside her and watched the tension of 4 months come out of her shoulders in a long, slow release that was almost visible. "It's done," she said. "The important part is done." "Yes," he said. "I need to go back to Colton Creek," she said. "There are things at the house, Thomas's things, and there are people I should tell, some of the families he wrote about. They deserve to know that something is happening." "I'll take you back," he said immediately. She looked at him. "Jacob, you've already given me 5 days of your time and complicated your life considerably on my behalf." "My life needed complicating," he said. "It had gotten too simple." She studied him with that careful regard that he had come to understand was how she processed things that mattered. Then she said, "Will you stay in Colton Creek after we return for a while?" There was vulnerability in that question that she had tried very carefully not to show, and that effort itself was what made it clear. He recognized it because it matched something in his own chest, a kind of reaching that felt unfamiliar because he had not reached like that in a very long time. "Yes," he said, "I'll stay." The road back to Colton Creek felt different than the road they had taken away from it. The urgency was gone, or at least transformed. It was no longer an emergency but a return, and the difference was felt in the rhythm of the horse's pace and in the way they talked. They talked more and more easily, and about larger and smaller things without the pressure of consequence shaping every word. He told her about the specific loneliness of years on the trail, not complaining, just describing, the way a man describes weather that has passed. He told her about a family in Abilene that he had visited occasionally in his youth, a Mexican family named Ramos who had a ranch east of town, and who had been, in ways he only recognized looking back, the closest thing to a home he had in those years. He told her about a horse he had once loved so much the loss of it had been a genuine grief. She told him about the first winter in Nevada, which had been harder than she and Thomas had expected, the cold and the isolation, and the way the desert looked in February, stripped of everything, just rock and pale sky and silence. She told him about the gradual discovery of what the desert was actually offering, once you stopped measuring it against what you had come from. She told him about learning to bake at altitude, which was a different science than baking in Ohio, and she told him about the day she had ridden out to the edge of the salt flat north of Colton Creek and sat on her horse watching the light move across it for an hour, and understood that she loved this land in a way that was entirely her own. "I don't want to leave it," she said. "I thought, when this started, that I might have to. That Hargrove's people would make it impossible to stay." "But now you don't have to leave," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't." She looked at him sideways with a careful warmth. "What do you want, Jacob, after all of this? What is it that you actually want?" He considered this honestly, as he did everything. "Land of my own," he said. "Not much, enough to run a modest operation, enough to build something that would still be there in 20 years." He paused, "and someone to build it with, that part most particularly." The pause between his words and whatever she might say next stretched long enough to feel like standing at the edge of something. Then she said quietly, "That is a good want." "I think so," he said. "I have a house," she said, in a tone that was carefully neutral and absolutely not neutral at all. "On the edge of Colton Creek. It's modest. The woodshed needs replacing." "I can build a woodshed," he said. "I know," she said. And they rode on, and the desert around them was brilliant in the afternoon light, and the silence between them was full of something growing. They arrived back in Colton Creek to find that Federal Marshal Bray had preceded them by a day. The difference in the town was palpable. There was a nervous energy in the streets that was not quite fear and not quite relief, but something in between, the particular feeling of a town that is reckoning with the discovery that the order it believed in was not the order that had actually been operating. Hargrove had been taken into federal custody the previous morning. Judge Aldrich had been served and confined to his home pending hearing. Cole Petty had apparently attempted to leave the territory and had been intercepted outside of Elko by a rider who had been sent in advance. Doyle's badge had been suspended, and he was confined to his office under federal supervision until his role in the matter could be formally assessed. Matilda walked through the changed town with the composed, steady presence of a woman who had known this day was possible and had worked toward it and was now watching it happen without any performance of triumph. People stopped her on the street. A woman from the general store, a rancher Jacob didn't know, a family he had not seen before who spoke quickly and with enormous feeling and whose land, he gathered from the intensity of the conversation, was among those documented in the ledger. She spoke to each of them with the same steady kindness, telling them what Prescott had told her, giving them the specific information they needed about the process ahead. He stood a little apart during these conversations, near their horses, and watched her, and he thought about the specific quality of a person who does the right thing not because the world rewards it. It so rarely did, but because they cannot locate any version of themselves that would do otherwise. He thought about Thomas Chandler, whom he had never met, and felt a genuine respect for a man whose work had been completed by his wife in a way he would have recognized. In the following days, Jacob made himself useful in Colton Creek in the quiet, practical way he was best at. He helped a ranching family south of town repair a fence line that Petty's men had cut. He drove a wagon of supplies to an elderly couple whose homestead was across the valley and who had been afraid to come into town while Hargrove's men were operating freely. He was present at Matilda's house in the late afternoons, where they sat on the porch in the October chill with coffee and talked while the light changed over the desert and the first stars came out. There was a slowness to these afternoons that was intentional on both sides, a mutual acknowledgement that what was developing between them was something to be treated with care. She was a widow. He was a man who had not made permanent choices. These were real conditions, not obstacles to be argued with, and both of them understood that the ground being laid here needed to be laid properly. He kissed her for the first time on the 6th evening back, and it was not impulsive or dramatic. They had been standing near the back of the house where she kept her garden, mostly turned for winter now, the last of the dried herb stalks bending in the evening wind, and she had said something about how she had planted lavender that first spring in Nevada because it had seemed like an act of faith, planting something that belonged to another climate and trusting the land to adapt. And he had looked at her, and she had looked at him, and the distance between them had closed without any decision being made about it. The kiss was quiet and unhurried and entirely certain, and when it ended they both remained where they were, close, and she put her forehead against his jaw and let out a breath, and he put his hand against the back of her head with the particular gentleness of someone handling something precious, and they stayed like that for a moment in the gathering evening, with the desert wind moving around them and the last light dying on the hills. "Jacob," she said softly. "Matilda," he answered, and her name in his voice sounded like something that had found the right home. November came to Colton Creek with the particular force of a high desert autumn, which was not gradual, but arrived all at once in the form of a cold front that turned the creek to ice along its edges and drove the remaining leaves from the cottonwoods in a single furious night. Matilda stoked her wood stove with an efficiency born of years, and the house was warm and smelled of pine smoke, and the bread she baked on Tuesday and Saturday mornings regardless of everything else. Jacob had taken up a room at the boarding house on Mill Street, which was the appropriate arrangement for an unmarried man in a town where people were already talking. People were, in fact, talking considerably, not unkindly mostly, because Matilda was respected in Colton Creek by the people who knew her, and Jacob had made a favorable impression in the practical ways that matter in small communities. The general store owner, a man named Willis Pratt, had told Jacob approvingly that any man who would stand up in front of Ira Doyle on behalf of a widow deserved to have his business welcomed in the county. Jacob had thanked him and bought a considerable amount of flour, coffee, and nails. The federal process moved forward with the grinding but real momentum of institutional machinery. Letters came to Matilda from Prescott's office, each one carrying news of incremental progress: Hargrove's indictment, Aldrich's removal from the bench, the initiation of a review process for the land transfers that had been documented in the ledger. It would take months, perhaps a full year, for all of the affected families to see their situations resolved, but the process was real and was being driven by people who had the authority to complete it. She kept each letter folded carefully in a wooden box on her desk and read them more than once. In December, a letter came from Prescott that was more significant than the others. It informed her that a formal inquest into Thomas Chandler's death had been initiated by the Federal Circuit Court, and that the evidence gathered in the course of the Hargrove investigation, including testimony from one of Petty's former associates who was cooperating with federal authorities in exchange for reduced charges, was sufficient to establish that Thomas's death had not been accidental, that he had, in fact, been murdered. The language of the letter was careful and legal, but the meaning was plain. Jacob was at the house when she read it. She had been standing at the kitchen table when she opened it, and she read it standing, and then she set it down and put both hands flat on the table and was very still. He came to her. He had been sitting in the front room, and he put his hand on her back between her shoulder blades with that quiet steadiness he always had. She did not turn around for a long moment. "He didn't fall," she said. Her voice was even, but barely. "No," Jacob said, "he didn't fall." "I knew it," she said. "I knew it from the first day, but knowing it and having someone official say it are different things." "Yes," he said, "they are." She turned then and put her face against his chest and held the fabric of his shirt in both fists, and he put his arms around her and held on, and she was not entirely silent for a moment. Just a moment. She was a woman who had kept herself together through 4 months of real danger and bureaucratic resistance and grief and uncertainty, and she allowed herself this one brief collapse with the particular intimacy of someone who trusts the person they are collapsing against. Then she straightened and dried her eyes with the back of her hand and said, "He deserved better than what happened to him." "Yes," Jacob said, "he did, and you gave him what he deserved in the end. You made sure it counted." She looked at Jacob with the full force of everything she was, the intelligence and the grief and the resilience and the beginning of something new, all of it together in one look. He held it without flinching, the way he held everything. "I am very glad you stood up in that back row," she said. "So am I," he said, with a conviction so thorough it required no elaboration. Christmas in Colton Creek was simple and cold and wonderful. Matilda had a tradition of cooking a large Christmas meal and inviting people who otherwise had nowhere to go, a habit she had begun with Thomas and continued with the particular stubbornness of someone who refuses to let grief dismantle the best versions of their own life. This year there were 6 people at her table: Jacob, Mrs. Aline Foster, an elderly woman from the edge of town, who had been among the first to stop Matilda on the street when she returned from Carson City; the Ramos family, a young Mexican couple who had recently arrived in Colton Creek and who had been treated with cold suspicion by most of the town until Matilda had pointedly befriended them; and young Danny Teague, a 17-year-old who worked at the livery and had no family anywhere within reach. The table was too small for 6, and the conversation was too large for the room, and the food was excellent, and Jacob sat at the end opposite Matilda and watched her move through the meal with the warmth and competence of someone entirely in their element, and he thought, This is the thing I have been looking for. Not a place, as he had always assumed, but this specific quality of life being lived fully and honestly, and with generosity toward the world around it. This person who had pulled him into her orbit by walking through a door he happened to be sitting near. After dinner, when the guests had gone and the dishes were done, they sat by the wood stove with small glasses of the brandy she kept for Christmas, and the fire ticked, and the cold outside pressed against the window glass, and the whole world was reduced to this warm room and this specific silence. "Jacob," she said. She had something in her voice that he recognized as the precursor to something important. "Yes," he said, giving her his full attention. "I have been thinking about what comes next," she said, with careful deliberateness. "For me, specifically, I have this house. I have a small settlement from Thomas's estate that provides a modest stability. I have now the particular freedom of a woman whose immediate crisis has been resolved." She turned her glass in her hands. "I have been asking myself what I want." He waited. "I want you," she said, clearly and without embellishment. "Not in a way that requires you to give up who you are, but I want you here, in whatever capacity makes sense and is right and is permanent." He put down his glass. He looked at her across the warm, fire-lit room, and he thought about 11 years of open country and 1,000 nights under open sky, and the particular loneliness of a man who moves through the world without anchoring in it. And he thought about the specific quality of what had happened since an October morning when a woman in a black bonnet walked through a door with a leather satchel and the full force of her will. "Marry me," he said, and it was not a planned statement, but it was not impulsive either. It had been forming since the Cottonwood Grove in Carson City, and it was simply now ready to be said. "Matilda Chandler, I am asking you to marry me. I am asking to be the man who builds a life in this house with you, and who stands beside you in whatever comes next, and who tries every day to deserve the quality of person you are." The firelight moved across her face. Her eyes were bright and certain and unafraid. "Yes," she said. "Jacob Shepard, yes." He crossed the room and sat beside her and took her hands in both of his, and they remained like that in the firelight for a long time, talking and then not talking, and the brandy went ignored, and outside the desert was cold and full of stars, and entirely indifferent to the specific miracle that was occurring inside a small house on its edge. They were married in the spring of 1883, on a Saturday in April when the desert was doing its brief, astonishing thing. The thing that people from elsewhere never quite believe is real, with wildflowers covering the valley floor in sheets of yellow and purple, brittle bush and phacelia and desert marigold, and the air warm enough for shirt sleeves by mid-morning. The ceremony was held in the small church on the east side of Colton Creek, which was a non-denominational building that had been used for everything from funerals to community meetings since its construction 7 years prior. The minister, a quiet man named Reverend Callahan, who had come west from Pennsylvania 15 years earlier and never found reason to go back, read the vows with the unhurried dignity appropriate to the occasion. Matilda wore a dress of blue-gray silk that she had ordered from a seamstress in Carson City, not white, because she was a widow, and she knew what she was, and had no interest in pretending otherwise, but beautiful, cut simply in the style of the period, with small pearl buttons at the cuffs that Thomas's mother had given her. and which she wore as a conscious acknowledgement that the past and the present could coexist. Jacob wore his best clothes, which had been recently acquired, and which fit him with a straightness that Mrs. Alcott, who had traveled from Carson City for the occasion, declared very handsome. He stood at the front of that small church and watched Matilda walk toward him on the arm of Willis Pratt, who had offered gallantly, and who was clearly moved by the occasion, and Jacob Shepard, who had spent 11 years in open country being moved by almost nothing sentimental, felt the particular earthquake of a man who has arrived exactly where he is supposed to be. She reached him and they stood face to face, and her eyes were the color of creek water in early morning, and his were the warm and steady brown she had trusted from the first moment she looked into them. And Reverend Callahan said the words, and they said theirs simple, direct, without embellishment. And when Jacob put the ring on her finger, he held her hand with both of his for a moment before he let go, and she looked at him with an expression that was entirely without reserve. The gathering after the ceremony at the house that was now theirs went on through the afternoon and into the evening. There were 20-some people, neighbors, and the families from the valley who had found their way back to their land through the federal process. The Ramos couple, Danny Teague from the livery, Mrs. Foster, who sat in the best chair and dispensed opinions freely. Agent Prescott had sent a letter of congratulation that arrived the morning of the wedding, which Matilda read at breakfast and which made Jacob feel, once again, the particular satisfaction of things having resolved as they should. Someone brought a fiddle. There was dancing in the yard in the late afternoon light, the kind of rough and joyful dancing that happens when people are genuinely celebrating rather than performing celebration. And Jacob danced with Matilda in the golden hour with a straightforward joy that was entirely new to him and entirely welcome. The life they built in Colton Creek was not dramatic. It was the particular kind of life that is only possible after the dramatic parts are done, the kind that is steady and specific and full of the daily labor that, taken together, amounts to happiness. Jacob ran a small cattle operation on the southern edge of their land, which Matilda had acquired through a legitimate land filing after the federal review of the Hargrove transfers released a parcel that had been improperly seized. It was not large, perhaps 160 acres, but it was sufficient, and it was theirs, and Jacob worked it with the competence of a man who had spent his whole adult life understanding land and animals, and was now applying that understanding to something that would still be there in 20 years. Matilda continued her work in the community with a focus that had sharpened rather than eased after the resolution of the Hargrove matter. She had become, almost without intending to, a person that people in the valley brought their problems to, not problems of law exactly, but problems of documentation, of dealing with institutions, of understanding what their rights were and how to exercise them. She had learned, through Thomas's example and her own hard experience, that information properly deployed was as powerful as anything else available to ordinary people, and she found deep satisfaction in sharing that knowledge. She also, in the spring of 1884, began to show the particular signs that required them to move Jacob's saddle from the spare room and consider the practical implications of a house that was about to contain one more person than it currently did. Jacob came in from the south field one afternoon to find her sitting at the kitchen table with both hands flat on it and an expression he had not seen before, a combination of certainty and wonder that was distinct from any of the other things her face had given him. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. He looked at her. He waited the way he was very good at waiting, she told him. He was quiet for a moment that went on long enough that she began, in the very back of her mind, to wonder about it. Then he reached across the table and covered both her hands with his, and he said, "Matilda," with a fullness in his voice she had never quite heard before, not the steady reassurance of the Jacob she had come to know, but something rawer and more alive, something that was specifically not kept back. "Yes," she said softly. "We are very fortunate people," he said. She turned one hand over under his and held on. "Yes," she said, We are. The summer of 1884 was long and hot, the way Nevada summers are absolutely, bone-deeply hot through July and August, with the heat shimmering off the desert floor and the nights warm enough to sleep outside on the porch if the desire took you. They did this sometimes, lying on blankets looking up at the stars, which were still extraordinary, and talking in the loose, unhurried way of people who are comfortable enough together that conversation does not require structure. Jacob built a cradle in the evenings, in the small workshop he had established at the back of the house where he kept tools, and did the smaller repairs that a working homestead continuously required. He was not a gifted carpenter. He was the first to say it, but he was a careful and determined one, and the cradle he produced by mid-August was solid and smooth and beautifully proportioned, and Matilda ran her hand along the side of it when he brought it in and said it was the finest thing she had ever seen, which was an overstatement, and they both knew it, and it was exactly what she should have said. Their son was born in October of 1884, delivered by the midwife, a formidable woman named Adele who had attended more births in Colton Creek than anyone else, on a Thursday morning when the cottonwoods along the creek had just turned gold. He arrived noisily and apparently determined to make his presence known from the first moment, and he was healthy and substantial, and had, Adele declared with satisfaction, a good set of lungs. Jacob held his son for the first time with the particular combination of amazement and terror and fierce protective love that is universal to that moment regardless of the century. He sat in the chair beside the bed where Matilda lay tired and luminous, and he looked down at the small, furious, extraordinary face of this new person, and then he looked up at his wife, and the thing that passed between them in that look was beyond what language does efficiently. "What will we call him?" Jacob asked. Matilda had thought about this. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Jacob Shepard." Jacob was still for a moment. Then he said, "That is the right name," and his voice held everything it needed to hold, and she reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he turned his face away for a moment and collected himself, and then he looked back at his son, who was Thomas Jacob Shepard, and who had his mother's eyes and his father's mouth, and who was entirely, completely, and perfectly himself. The federal process regarding Hargrove and the displaced families concluded, in its full bureaucratic arc, in the fall of 1885. Hargrove was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy, and received a sentence that involved both significant fines and a term in a federal penitentiary. Judge Aldrich was removed from the bench permanently and faced civil liability that cost him nearly everything he had accumulated. Cole Petty, whose cooperation had been partial, received a reduced sentence but was effectively finished as an operative in the territory. Marshal Doyle lost his badge and his pension and moved somewhere east, which was as much as anyone in Colton Creek knew or cared. 17 of the 23 displaced families documented in Thomas's ledger received formal reinstatement of their land claims through the Federal Review. The remaining 6 involved complications in the title history that made clean resolution impossible, but those families received financial settlements that, while not equivalent to the land itself, provided meaningful remedy. Prescott wrote to Matilda to inform her of the final accounting, and she read his letter at the kitchen table on a November morning while Thomas Jacob, who was 13 months old and had recently discovered that he could pull himself upright by gripping the table legs, held onto the nearest chair, and examined the world from a new angle with an expression of profound satisfaction. She set the letter down and looked at her son, who looked back at her with Thomas's eyes in Jacob's face, which was a thing that moved her every single day without diminishing. Then she picked him up and went to the door and called for Jacob, who was coming up from the south field, and when he reached the porch she handed him the letter and Thomas and went inside to put on coffee, because some news needs to be received with your hands full of something real. Jacob read the letter standing on the porch with his son in the crook of his arm, and Thomas grabbed at the edge of the paper with the industriousness of a child who does not yet distinguish between important documents and everything else. Jacob let him hold one corner because the important things had been read, and what remained was official language. And he finished the letter, and then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket, next to the place where he had once put the fee envelope from Doyle's office on that October morning, when a woman in a black bonnet had changed the direction of his life. He stood on the porch and looked out at the valley, which was November bare, and therefore in the specific way of the desert more clearly itself, all rock and sage and long horizon, and the sky going enormous and pale blue above it. He had been looking at this view for 2 years, and he was quite certain, going to be done looking at it for a very long time. He shifted his son to his shoulder, and Thomas made a sound of contentment and grabbed a fistful of Jacob's collar, and Jacob went inside. She was at the stove, and she turned when she heard him, and he came to her and put his free arm around her, and she leaned into him with the easy, total trust of 2 years of a real marriage. And Thomas, between them, looked from one face to the other with the large and bright interest of a child who is learning that this is home. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She looked up at him. "Are you happy, Jacob Shepard?" He looked at her, at everything she was, everything she had been when he first saw her walking into a hostile room with her leather satchel and her absolute certainty, and everything she had become in the time since, which was both more and the same thing, the way people are when you know them long enough to see all the layers. He looked at their son, who had his grandmother's red in his hair and his mother's eyes, and who was currently engaged in the important work of trying to eat Jacob's collar. He looked at the house around them, at the window that looked out over the valley, at the wood stove that kept them warm, at the shelves she had put up for her books and his, at the cradle in the corner that Thomas had mostly outgrown but that Matilda had not yet moved because she was not done looking at it either. "Happy," he said, "is too small a word." He turned it over once more. "But yes, absolutely, happy." She smiled, the full and brilliant smile that he had first seen in the cottonwood grove in Carson City, and that still, 2 years and a child and a life later, moved through him like weather, and she stood on her toes and kissed him. And Thomas objected to being temporarily excluded from the attention by making his opinion very loudly known, and Jacob laughed, which was a sound that had become comfortable in this house in a way that still surprised him sometimes with its completeness. In the years that followed, Jacob and Matilda built their life with the same quality of care and honesty and mutual regard that had characterized them from the beginning. The cattle operation grew modest and dependable, providing enough that they did not want, though not so much that the work lost its meaning. Matilda continued to be, in the community of the valley, the person people came to when they needed someone who understood how things were supposed to work and was willing to stand between them and whatever was trying to take advantage of the gap between what was supposed to happen and what was actually happening. Thomas Jacob Shepard grew from an opinionated infant into an opinionated small boy with a gift for languages and an inexhaustible curiosity about the natural world, which he examined with the methodical intensity of a person who had inherited a surveyor's instincts from one direction and a trail reader's instincts from another. He was 7 when his sister arrived, a girl they named Elena Ruth Shepard, who came into the world with the same decisive energy as her brother, and immediately set about establishing her own particular relationship with everything and everyone around her. And on the evenings when both children were asleep and the desert was dark and full of stars, Jacob and Matilda sat on the porch with their coffee and their comfortable silence, and sometimes he read aloud to her from whatever he was currently moving through. He had long since finished Defoe and gone through considerable territory since, and sometimes she told him things she was thinking about, real things, the kind that needed someone to listen rather than respond, and he listened. Because he had always listened well. And sometimes they simply sat in the specific piece of a life that had been built honestly, on the ruins of loss and the foundation of courage, by two people who had each been formed by this hard and magnificent land into exactly who they needed to be in order to find each other. The cottonwoods along Colton Creek turned gold every October, and every October Matilda looked at them from the porch with the particular attention she had given them in Carson City in 1882, when a man who had been a stranger told her she was going to be all right. The desert stretched out beyond the valley in every direction toward horizons that still felt limitless. The children grew and the cattle grazed, and the seasons moved around the house in their ancient, reliable cycles, and Jacob Shepard, who had spent 11 years looking for the right place and had found instead the right person, understood at last that these had always been the same thing. On the morning of their 5th wedding anniversary, he woke before her for once, which rarely happened, and he lay in the early gray light watching her sleep with the look of a man who has not gotten accustomed to his own fortune and does not intend to. She stirred and opened her eyes and found him watching, and she did not do what some people do when they are watched sleeping. She did not become self-conscious or look away. She looked back with all the steadiness and warmth and clarity that had been in her eyes since the first moment in Doyle's office when he had crossed the room to stand beside her. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. "Happy anniversary, Matilda Chandler." The name still fit her perfectly. It always had. She had grown into it in the specific way of something that was always the right size and only needed to be worn for a while to prove it. "Happy anniversary, Jacob," she said. Outside, the desert was beginning to show the first pale light of an April dawn, and the cottonwoods were full of new leaves, and the children were still asleep in their rooms, and the cattle in the south field were grazing in the early quiet, and everything that had been built from the rubble of grief and injustice, and a Tuesday morning in October when one cowboy stood up from the back row was exactly, precisely, and permanently in place. He reached for her hand under the blankets, and she gave it to him without looking away, and the light came up over the desert hills in the colors of a world that had no patience for being reduced to something smaller than itself. And neither did they, and that was exactly how they had always preferred it and always would.